All right. Hello, welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, Zach, and today we'll be resuming our reading and literary analysis of Peter Wessel Zappfe's Last Messiah. It's basically a story about human repression, and he frames it in a mythology. Then he kind of covers the psychological aspects of repression, the subtext being projection and transference. But before I get into that, I was thinking about it from the perspective of if he wrote this mythos in 1933, and there's been countless written since, where are we at? And then technically the we means nothing, because I've said it before that all civilizations and societies, except individual tribes, are many groups of interlocking rings that for the most part seldom meet or seldom have any business together. So technically there is no we, right? And that's hits first in terms of where are we at? There is no we. And it goes, man is forced into a strange position, a post-historical life which means no closure. Believers won't be able to have it given the perpetual warfare, and nihilists are left to create their own values. I said yesterday nihilism is a disbelief in man and everything generally, but especially a disbelief in man. I also said it's a momentary stage in psychological growth. All interim stages of psychological growth within and without civilization, right? Because the whole myth of civilization is that we have a claim to everything. We have a claim on you. We know all this, right? Not you. We gave it to you, not you, us. That kind of perspective, let's say. So all those interim psychological stages of growth within and without civilization have always been held in check with repressive mechanisms. All of culture from in to outside is a very narrow map of what is acceptable to know, to think, to say, to do, etc. A lot of it's superstitious, a lot of it's old, a lot of it's new. All of it has been and will be outgrown in many respects. And people who don't outgrow mankind's juvenile psychology of a naive, fearful, and insecure ape in perpetuity, mind you, will be dragged along relentlessly and regardless, because that aspect of history making, even in a post-historical world, has not changed. Every man and woman is bound to the material from which we spring, and not everyone is in a position to be a seeker, but that's what's been forced on mass man, on the last man. A book like Modern Man in Search of a Soul by Carl Jung gives a very rudimentary and even now outdated look at this picture. The thing about being a seeker is maybe you don't find, or maybe you die en route. And from there, after you found what was yours, right? Because you can only see what belongs to you. You can only have what belongs to you, really. The thing about being a seeker is after you found it, assuming you even do, you're then left to do what with what you found? You're left to create, right? There's no other options or avenues. Post history is otherwise largely, this is the aftermath. It's largely work, shopping, or leisure, or worse, just excess mindless consumption. So the question, and attention seeking really, but the question of where are we at on any sort of timeline or map comes to mind. For a simple moment in time, you can see where we've arrived. Incidental rhyme. Just as civilizational organizations once transitioned from a post-oral culture to a written culture with the discoveries and adaptations of written language, so more technologies have changed our lives and ways of life forever in the last 300 years, and even in the last 100 years, maybe in the last 25 years, than forever before. And by that I mean more permanent change has happened in the last few hundred years than all prior human history. So it takes us from our location of where we were at to, of being this civilization seeking oneness, totalitarian rule, global rule, ideologically driven idealism, right, that never matches the reality. It's left us as a post-literate and psychedelically retribalized civilization. And just so you know, what I'm saying here, I'm not saying this is strict truth, right? This might as well be another mythology like all the other mythologies, like even the Big Bang, let's say, right? One of the most unlikely things that something came from nothing. For all we know, the universe is way older than what it is. But, in this Post-literate, psychedelically retribalized civilization, everyone can know everyone's businesses. Pagan impulses and clashes and channeling of instincts find their home in rumors, conflicts, new organizations and forces, new mobilizations, infinite mobilizations, right? As well as old and new myths, mythologies. And for living in a decentralized world where man and power and history vanish into its own horizon, people's thought structures, that is their persona, their ego, still follows a more mythical structure. And by that I simply mean narrative, right? It's the story, just like Zapffe was illustrating the other day. The child, he's safe at home and then he has to go to school. So he tells himself, I know tomorrow school starts. And then he goes to graduate from school, and then what's going to happen? Oh, I'm going to go get a job. And then, from there, we can just look on down the river of life and see how it ends. It's interesting that I'll say at this juncture that McKenna points out that to know how the story ends is a certain kind of enlightenment if you can actually face those truths. And then from there, I would add knowing how a civilization ends, knowing how entire peoples and cultures and belief systems end is also a form of enlightenment. So this takes us to McKenna and McLuhan. Man is stuck in a changed world, that in some senses he has no real or natural environment or relation thereto, no horizon and no meaning. I'm not counting Leviathanism. I'm not counting the war of all against all. What is that is civilization. It's a very male perspective. It's hostile. It's insufficient too. It's not good enough, and it can't help but collapse. So stuck in this changed world, has no real or natural environment or relation, no horizon, no meaning that can be given, right? Things can be instructed, monkeys can be taught to do tasks, even work at typewriters, yet he is forced up against material necessity and the structures of the world that cannot and will not change because they obtain their perfection, right? We have discovered happiness. We have invented humanity. Formerly, the world was insane. We now know what is good and right, right? You'd have to be insane to not know what's good and right. It's so obvious in this vast expanse of power before you. So, the structure of the world as preset scripts, right, they can only be what people already said or say they are, is the environment that drives scripted behavior due to the scripted technology's effects on the environment. Procedure, where man goes to die on the assembly line. Politics, where certain kinds of men and women depart in service to themselves. Everything is already owned and known. The world is a problem, and that problem is either solved or in the process of being solved. It actually doesn't really need humanity. It doesn't need humanity any longer. It's solved itself. Tragedy is out of place here. Suffering doesn't belong. Happiness is being reinvented. Reality is statistical. The happy few checked out a long time ago, and they live distant in their own little world. Man is in his own little hostile world, kept to fall into not just infinite possibilities, as Zapffe says, but also real inevitabilities. And this is what drives him most insane, right? It's mortality that drives man insane, but especially his itchy trigger finger, his insecurity, right? His inability and unwillingness to deal with the unknown or what's outside himself. Because modern man is so solipsistic, even though they put up the guise of not being, they're so off in their own little worlds that they don't even see that that's what they're kind of representing and that's what they're showing, right? There's no repressing the future, and there never has been. There's no escaping that arrow shot to the end of time, that cosmic draw, and no amount of repression in the world will stop the future or save anyone. Each man is left to save himself. And it's been said, many a one cannot loosen his own fetters, but is nevertheless his friend's emancipator. Art thou a slave? Then thou canst not be a friend. Art thou a tyrant? Then thou canst not have friends. And this is all in an environment where the high idealism and imitation of yesterday's fashion and styles remain, which is the furthest thing removed from a reality organized, industrialized, and scripted, further scripted to be as automated as possible, to be as involved as little thinking or brain power as possible, scripted in speech as well, as little creativity as possible, as little originality as possible, scripted to cater to every lowest common denominator possible, wrapped up in too much pointless busy work, paperwork, and bureaucracy. So that's where we're at. Now, like I said, this isn't strictly true. I'm just kind of framing the situation. There's something inside me knowing that, you know what, I don't know everything. And there's probably something like infinite patterns, infinite possible patterns I haven't picked up on yet. And I can see a few in particular here that I'm lacking data and more is coming in. You know, we learn in time, right? We wake up in time. So we're going to go on ahead and resume reading Peter Wessel Zaffe's The Last Messiah here. Get us there. And where we left off more specifically yesterday, I think this is distraction, right? The distraction for human beings works no different than that for airplanes, right? The principle that keeps it in the air works so long as it's moving, but the crisis is acute the moment the engine flunks. So the tactic is often fully conscious, and this is actually Orwell's doublethink, right? You know you're fooling yourself, but you do it because the fooling yourself is better than being honest or real or truthful, or what, you know, and that's a weird thing to say. You know, what is truth? Especially in a post-historical, post-truth, post-meta-narrative era. Despair may dwell right underneath the surface and break through in gushes, in a sudden sobbing. When all distractive options are expended, right, this is me mentioning, Gurdjieff's mentioned that the more we depend on electronics and electricity, the more catastrophic that failure ever is. Spleen sets in, ranging from mild indifference to fatal depression. Women in general less cognition prone, oh, that's sexist, Zapffe, oh, and hence more secure in their living than men, right? That's funny, right? Because they know here's where he's right, that civilization does cater to women. I said this in the last video, right? That the whole thing's about repressing men, repressing violence, and what the herd and what history learned in the last century was, hey, if you train the masses to attack individuals, there can never be an individual again, right? And that's what we see with, you know, further domestication of man. I don't know how else to put it. You know, sit, boy, speak. Not those words, these words only. You know, tactic is often fully conscious. Despair. They preferably use distraction, right? In America, soap operas, shopping, right? These have long been the pastimes of American women. A considerable evil of imprisonment is the denial of the most distractive options, and as terms for deliverance by other means are poor as well, the prisoner will tend to stay in close vicinity of despair, right? It's known as like the prisoner's catatonia, kind of, right? It's a depression of sorts, environmentally derived depression. The acts he then commits to deflect the final stage have a warrant in the principle of vitality itself. In such a moment, he is experiencing his soul within the universe and has no other motive than the utter inendurability of that condition. Meaning, it's an act of vitality. It's a last gasp of the will, like almost trying to prove to itself it's alive. And speaking of violence, you know, it's always in service of and to something. It's always to make or break rank, right? And it's always related to identity. So that identity also relates with these last gasps of violence. And I don't even want to bring the kind of topic and subject matter into this conversation with how horrible it is, given the kind of modern, far-flung and homespun terrorism that has spun out of our reality. And it happens on a daily and regular basis. So, pure examples of life panic are presumably rare, as the protective mechanisms are refined and automatic and to some extent unremitting, right? They're ceaseless. People are ceaselessly repressing themselves, their behavior, their thoughts, their feelings, and other people are doing it to them as well, and they're doing it to each other. But even the adjacent terrain bears the mark of death. Life is here barely sustainable, and by great efforts. Death always appears as an escape. One ignores the possibilities of the hereafter, and as the way death is experienced is partly dependent on feeling and perspective, it might be quite an acceptable solution. If one in statu mortis could manage a pose, a poem, a gesture to die standing up, heroic death, i.e. a final anchoring or final distraction, asis death, then such a fate is not the worst one at all. The press, for once serving the concealment mechanism, never fails to find reasons that cause no alarm. It is believed that the latest fall in the price of wheat, right? They're endlessly running their mouth. A lot of the times you can see in media journalism, it's all bad, it's all poison, it's always been bad and poison. It's never been literature, it's never been culture, it's been selling advertising space, making money for people who write at a fifth grade level, and also for the general populace, which is a recent invention, right? These are all recent inventions, everyone. So what he's pointing out is that they're quick to speculate, they're quick to fill in the gaps. Like I mentioned with the authorities, the professionals, everyone who's parroting what they've been taught to parrot, right? They never know what they're talking about. They have the illusion of it, though, just because the basic model that predates them, that precedes them, that educated them, and that they copied, proves it, right? It's not the individuals, right? In modern times, the mass man, individuals are completely replaceable. It doesn't matter whether it's a leader of a nation or an entire organization. It could just be removed and no one would notice or care because they're so numerous and endless, right? And that there's so many of them that they're fully replaceable. We've been over this and a lot of other content and literature, but we are talking about something more specific here. When a human being takes his life in depression, this is a natural death of spiritual causes. I think he's right here, right? A spirit being life cutting into itself, right? Life challenging itself. If there's a bow shot into the arrow, it's by the bow, or if there's a arrow shot into the future by our present bow, and that's perpetually following the original arrow that was shot in the past into our future, then you would say that that whole process is forever life cutting into itself, or the arrow sinking into the flesh. Maybe it is like Emil Cioran said, that consciousness isn't just a thorn in the side, it's a dagger in the flesh. Now, I know that's a bit extreme and dramatic, and a lot of people do get stuck in that depressive head state, but that's exactly what Zapffe is talking about, and that I think it's just it's passive nihilism. It's nihilism not yet overcome. It's the lack of psychological growth. But again, like what I discussed in our original conundrum, it's in a very tribal and destructive environment. So good luck, individual or collective man, right? Like I said, the notion of we is absurd. There is no we. When a human being takes his life in depression, this is a natural death of spiritual causes. Life cutting into life. The modern barbarity of saving the suicidal is based on a hair-raising misapprehension of the nature of existence, right? And this is how juvenile modern people are. This is how they've been prefabricated. This is what culture has taught them. It's not their fault, but it's beyond disturbing. It's beyond disturbing for so many that it becomes a matter of ending it, right? So these are serious things that the culture itself cannot take seriously. It can only handle it with mass solutions, mass-oriented solutions. It has nothing to do with individual human beings, right? So only a limited part of humanity can make do with mere changes, whether in work, social life, or entertainment. The cultured person demands connections, lines, a progression in the changes. Nothing finite satisfies at length. One is ever proceeding, gathering knowledge, making a career. The phenomenon is known as yearning or transcendental tendency. In modern times, it's failure, it's called ennui, right? Those kinds of things. Whenever a goal is reached, the yearning moves on. Hence, its object is not the goal, but the very attainment of it, right? The object of great desire isn't love, it's more. The gradient, not the absolute height of the curve representing one's life. The promotion from private to corporal may give a more valuable experience than the one from colonel to general, right? So he's saying that it's kind of arbitrary that the actual growth and the actual experiences, they might be better in the beginning than they ever could be in the end, right? That notion of ascending through life, it only ever goes so far before man is left with himself again, right? This is where history has arrived. We've come full circle, right? Congratulations, species, you're general man. And you're unimportant, replaceable, and technically we can't even allow individuals to exist anymore because culture has taken everything. Or mass civilization in its lowest common denominators have taken everything. It's in the imitation of culture from thousands of years ago. So talking about progression, Any grounds of progressive optimism are removed by this major psychological law. So the idea is, as you progress, the optimism wanes because eventually you're still looking down that waterfall of life and you know how it ends. And it's all the more, and it can be all the more bewildering if your progressions or your accomplishments or whatever it is aren't satisfying or fail to satisfy. So, Western Civ in a nutshell. The human yearning is not merely marked by a striving toward, but equally by an escape from samsara, right? The world of illusion, into the world of illusion. And if we use the word in a religious sense, only the latter description fits. For here, none has yet been clear about what he is longing for, but one has always a heartfelt awareness that one is longing away from, namely the earthly vale of tears, one's own unendurable condition. If awareness of this predicament is the deepest stratum of the soul, as argued above, then it is also understandable, right? It's Buddhistic levels of seeking and suffering that the Western world, as a whole civilization, as a physiology that's beaten and tamed with slavery and fear and hatred, right? Not Eastern understanding, not mutual arising, not the Tao and the how of life, but the fear and the panic and the neuroticism and the constant medicalizing and increasing, delusional progression of life, the illusion of history, that, that this Western world has refused to wake up to. This is our repression. This is our noble lie, right? That it gets better, that there's more to it, that people know what they're doing, that this hasn't already happened before, and that it won't happen again. It will happen again, right? Anyway, kind of running with it there. But if awareness of this predicament is the deepest stratum of the soul, as argued above, then it's also understandable why the religious yearning is felt and experienced as fundamental. By contrast, the hope that it forms a divine criterion, which harbors a promise of its own fulfillment, is placed in a truly melancholy light by these considerations. The oxymoron of it, the contradiction, again, that torsion and that differential between the idealism and its ideologies and the reality. So the fourth remedy against panics is sublimation, is a matter of transformation rather than repression, right? So this is the different one. This is the rare one. Almost no one actually can do this, right? Most people are stuck doing double think and double speak. Through stylistic or artistic gifts can the very pain of living at times be converted into valuable experiences. Positive impulses engage the evil and put it to their own ends, fastening it onto it pictorial, dramatic, heroic, lyric, or even comic aspects. So he's talking about art, the genesis of art, the birth of tragedy too. Unless the worst sting of suffering is blunted by other means or denied control of the mind, such utilization is unlikely. However, image, right? And Zapffe was a mountaineer. He was a mountain climber. The mountaineer does not enjoy his view of the abyss while choking with vertigo. Only when this feeling is more or less overcome does he enjoy it, meaning he's anchored. To write a tragedy, one must to some extent free oneself from, betray, the very feeling of tragedy and regard it from an outer, e.g. aesthetic point of view. And he's re-quoting Nietzsche here. He's letting you know it's a matter of aesthetics, right? That the only real cope with life is an aesthetic phenomenon. Right? And if you didn't create it, it means you're buying it from someone else. So here is, by the way, an opportunity for the wildest round dancing through ever higher ironic levels into a most embarrassing circulus vitiosus. Here one can chase one's ego across numerous habitats, and maybe you could even say this is like a Peter Sloterdijk kind of dig, like in his book Nietzsche's Apostle, at that kind of Zarathustrian super ego that the happiest thing in the world is that I exist and I'm happy to be here. And I'm not criticizing Nietzsche or Zarathustra. I'm just saying, like, why did this happen? How did this happen? Why would someone write this? How could they write this? And he's saying it's chasing one's ego through ever more ironic levels, right? Because it's stratum of this unreality. So here one can chase one's ego across numerous habitats, enjoying the capacity of the various layers of consciousness to dispel one another. So it's basically, he's saying, Sublimators inevitably are playing a shell game with themselves, and they're playing a shell game with others. The only question then is, how well do they play it? Is it enjoyable, and do they hide themselves well? Or is it too frightening or too alien, or too just tyrannical or slavish? So the present essay is a typical attempt at sublimation, right? And he mentions jargon, alcohol, it's a good time. The author does not suffer. He is filling pages and is going to be published in a journal. The martyrdom of lonely ladies also shows a kind of sublimation. They gain in significance thereby. Nevertheless, sublimation appears to be the rarest of the protective means mentioned here. It is possible for primitive natures to renounce these cramps and cavorts, or he's asking the question, is it possible for primitive natures to renounce these cramps and cavorts and live in harmony with themselves in the serene bliss of labor and love, insofar as they may be considered human at all? And remember, he's just talking about the honest, civilized aspect that represses all that it doesn't know. So it actually doesn't know anything about nature or primitive natures. Modern Western man knows nothing about what it is to live as a tribal creature except through a poisoned eros, in modern propaganda and warfare at that. So it's not even relatable. And Zaffe's kind of proving a point here. The strongest claim to be made about the so-called peoples of nature, right, whether it's Rousseauian or even there's a criticism of Terence McKenna too, is that they are somehow closer to the wonderful biological ideal than we unnatural people. And when even we have so far been able to save a majority through every storm, right, through every lowest common denominator, we keep surviving, right? God, we have been assisted by the sides of our nature that are just modestly or moderately developed. This positive basis, as protection alone cannot create life, only hinder its faltering, right? We can only drag you along so far, must be sought in the naturally adapted employment of the energy in the body and the biological helpful parts of the soul. And this is where he gives his first footnote, which I think we can get to real quick. A distinction for clarity, he's saying. Biologically helpful parts of the soul, subject to such hardships as are precisely due to sensory limitations, bodily frailty, and the need to do work for life and love. And essentially, I remember when I first read this to even now, when I read this, he's basically saying it's out of touch. We're out of touch with them. They're out of touch with us. And there's no bridging that divide without killing their very soul, right? There's this old idea I've talked about before, the death of a soul, that after many tribal and other people were either wiped out, assimilated, or annihilated, inevitably they turn to addictions, just like the civilization itself. And also with the loss of their myth, the loss of their environment, and their without their eros, E-R-O-S, that connected them to their environment, right? Because it's a system of connections. It's a greater power and unity and bridge, unifying power and bridge. It's like here they are. They have no environment. They have no way of life. They have no soul anymore. They have no love. They have no labor. Now they're left to imitate their conquerors. So, moving on. And just as this infinite land of bliss within the fronts due the progressing civilization, technology and standardization have such a debasing influence. For an ever-growing fraction of the cognitive faculties retire from the game against the environment. Right? It's that even the false notion of survival of the fittest isn't true any longer. And that's a very base notion. Survival of the fittest says nothing about the evolution of the Zaffe's archer by the watering hole, right? Which is a profound spiritual statement about life. So, for as an ever-growing fraction of the cognitive faculties retire from the game, right, there is a rising spiritual unemployment. The value of it, and I just mentioned it, right? And I said it in my written intro too. The value of a technical advance to the whole undertaking of life must be judged by its contribution to the human opportunity for spiritual occupation, not busy work, not wasting your life in a shopping mall or online consuming content or doing stuff when you could be creating or doing something yourself. Though boundaries are blurry, perhaps the first tools for cutting might be mentioned as a case for positive invention. Other technical inventions enrich only the life of the inventor himself, meaning the very invention robs everyone else. So AI just robbed a lot of artists and writers, for instance, right? Just like white collar technologies and other technologies have been robbing blue collar workers for centuries. So other technical inventions enrich only the inventor. They represent a gross and ruthless theft of man. And I like this. Rather than saying they're stealing money from people, he's saying you're stealing spirituality. You're stealing love and life from people. This is where I stand. You know, Marx is right about some things, but just like a lot of philosophies from the Stone Age, you know, of course, you know, you can see that the sun rises and sets. We can see some things and witness them daily to see truth in them. You don't need a large philosophy to write that. So what Zapffe is arguing here for is that these are spiritual matters. It's a matter of life challenging itself. So it's a ruthless theft of the common reserve of experiences and should invoke the harsh. Oh yeah, and by the way, just so you guys, in case you didn't know, Zapffe has actually been categorized by, oh, here we go, the Conspiracy Against the Human Race. He talks about Zapf's Last Messiah as a work of pessimistic literature. It's not insofar as he's not actually a proponent of it. Zapffe lets you know he's doing just fine. He's a mountain climber enjoying his time here. He's also one of the first antinatalists, or he's viewed as one of them because he chose, back in his time, it was weird to not have kids. It's still in some sense seen as weird or incomplete. And I would say only insofar as it seems like a lot of people who don't have kids are very immature, although you can see that most people with kids, my critique of culture says it, they're no more mature. They just have a new object of their misplaced affection and worship. You know, if not a human being, a cat or a dog. Anyway, going on here, he's saying these are the crimes. It's not the money side of it, it's the spiritual side of it. One such crime among numerous others is the use of flying machines, aeroplanes they were called, to explore uncharted land. In a single vandalistic glob, one thus destroys lush opportunities for experience that could benefit many if each by effort obtained his own fair share. And, you know, if we follow this to its furthest conclusion, destroy all cars so we can walk everywhere. Well, we've changed the environment too much, at least where we live, to cater to that. And so much of these other technologies have changed the world, except in the rarest, remotest, untouched regions that we still probe and get metal with. This is where Zapffe is also the godfather of conservation, which we'll see shortly, because remember, he's ahead of his time here. You know, that he inspired so many antinatalists, conservationists, the kind of global warming movement, and those kinds of thinking, because he tells you it's actually a lot of trouble we're in for here. It's serious, and people can't take it seriously because, again, no one ever sees it happening in time. I said it just earlier. Yesterday's down the memory hole before tomorrow's even arrives. So how could you expect anyone to know or remember anything or to ever recognize the danger they're in, right? It's easy to see danger with your eyes. Everyone can see the snake on the ground. It's much harder to see the snake inside your friend or the snake inside your stranger, right? And this is where the extroverted, psychotic, very the low baseline of the extroverted cultural world is blind as a bat and deaf and dumb and headed for disaster. This is what Zapffe is talking about. Okay, here's where he gets to his predictions in Zapf's prophecy. And, you know, he's working off Freudian, Jungian, Nietzschean extrapolation here. Modes of thought, perspectives of thought, right? It's not about simplistic judgments and oversimplified systematic thought that can somehow fit back into the God in the machine. Ain't gonna happen. So the current phase of life's chronic fever is particularly tainted by this circumstance. The absence of naturally or biologically based spiritual activity shows up, for example, in the pervasive recourse to distraction, even mountain climbing, right? Hey, life is so boring, you're going to go put yourself in danger? Wow, how fortunate are you, right? This is all, that could only happen with modern industrial civilization. Entertainment, sport, radio, the rhythm of the times. Terms for anchoring are not as favorable. You can hear my voice giving out a little bit from projecting. Excuse me. So the pervasive recourse to distraction, entertainment, sport, radio, the rhythm of the times, terms for anchoring are not as favorable. All the inherited collective systems of anchoring are punctured by criticism and anxiety, disgust, confusion, right? Critical theory, despair leaking through the rifts, postmodern theory, all the way to hyper reality, and now none of it matters. It's all yesterday. It's all post-history. It's all prehistory. There was Stone Age, history, post-history, too many corpses in the cargo. Oh, and then here's where he talks about the limits of all this, of what, the recent inventions. Communism and psychoanalysis, however incommiserate otherwise, both attempt, as communism also has a spiritual reflection, by novel means to vary the old escape anew. Right? It's a new story of liberation. It's a new mythology. It's a new overarching narrative, applying respectively violence and guile to make humans biologically fit by ensnaring their critical surplus of cognition. In essence, why go to the revolution when you can turn on the TV? Why have a revolution when you have satisfaction and infinite art, distraction, entertainment at your hand? You don't need to create it, you can consume it. So, to vary the old escape anew, applying respectively violence and guile, the idea in either case is uncannily logical, but again, it cannot yield a final solution. Though a deliberate degeneration to a more viable nadir may certainly save the species in the short run, it will by its nature be unable to find peace in such resignation, if indeed find any peace at all. Right? So it's just big brother kind of totalitarianism of civilization from here on out. And I don't even mean, it's like big brother who doesn't even care enough to say thou art, but he's going to unconsciously and subliminally fabricate your culture and your way of life and your thinking to let you know that. So section 5, if we continue these considerations to the bitter end, then the conclusion is not in doubt. As long as humankind recklessly proceeds in the fateful delusion, as Terence McKenna's prophecies, of being biologically, except, he kept trying to engineer a way out rather than recognizing this is where we're at. Delusion of being biologically fated for triumph, nothing essential will change. As its numbers mount and the spiritual atmosphere thickens, the techniques of protection must assume an increasingly brutal character. This is fake news. This is social media. This is nonstop psychological warfare. This is reinventing history and reality on the fly. This is hyper reality, right? This is all postmodern. And humans will persist in dreaming of salvation and affirmation and a new Messiah. Yet when many saviors have been nailed to trees and stoned in the city squares, then the last Messiah shall come. Ooh, and he's a pessimist. Then will appear the man who, as the first of all, has dared strip his soul naked and submit it alive to the outmost thought of the lineage, the very idea of doom, the very thing we sought to get rid of and escape in the first place. A man who has fathomed life and its cosmic ground, and whose pain is the earth's collective pain. With what furious screams shall not mobs of all nations cry out for his thousandfold death, when, like a cloth, his voice encloses the globe, and the strange message has resounded for the first and last time. The life of the worlds is a roaring river, but earth's is a pond and a backwater. The sign of doom is written on your brows. How long will ye kick against the pinpricks, right? And he's getting biblical, aka religious in his language here. But there is one conquest and one crown, one redemption and one solution. Know yourselves. Twist on Socrates. Be infertile and let the earth be silent after ye. Right? The whole thing is a twist on Socrates, psychoanalysis, the whole span of humanity can be known, civilization can be designed. Once God is dead, we can build a God in the machine. Sorry, that's not how the story goes. It's just not. Anyway, the point of all this, and Zapffe mentions earlier footnote I forgot real quick. He says, I emphasize that this is not about fantastic reform proposals, right? He's not saying this is about systematic philosophy or politics that are going to help anyone or save anyone, but rather a psychological view of these principles. And it's a particular spot in his essay, but you can see the wider application and understanding he demonstrates. And I've already been going on a while here. I think I've said more than enough for the moment. This has been Peter Wessel Zapffe, The Last Messiah, the essay about the repression at the heart of Western culture that everything from our highest arts to our lowest arts and our lowest common denominator tends towards. The reality that people die, everyone's going to die, civilizations themselves rise, fall, and collapse. and that's just where the world is at right now. It's been many thousand year process of trying to twist it all together, and now just as it's been twisting together, it's twisting apart. So thank you for your time and attention. I'm Zach Markowski with Sharper Pen Image Consulting, and I'll catch you on the next one. Take care.